People who discovered their pilot was unlicensed mid-flight. What happened? We were at 9,000 feet when the instrument panel started making a sound I did not recognize, and the man in the left seat, the man I had been calling Captain Reeves for 40 minutes, reached forward and tapped the altimeter with two fingers the way you tap a gas gauge you do not trust. That gesture, that small, uncertain tap, that was the first moment I understood that something was wrong in a way that no amount of rationalization was going to fix. I was sitting in the co-pilot seat of a Cessna 414A twin-engine aircraft, somewhere over the Central Valley of California, hired by my company to evaluate a charter air service for a contract that would involve transporting engineering survey teams to remote sites 6 to 8 times per year. I was 36 years old, a licensed private pilot with 412 hours of logged flight time, which was enough to know what a pilot looks like when he is uncertain about his own instruments. Reeves did not look uncertain the way tired pilots look uncertain, the casual fatigue of someone who has seen this situation 1,000 times. He looked uncertain the way people look when they are encountering something they are not sure they have the training to handle. My hands were in my lap. I did not move them. The sound the instrument panel was making was a low, intermittent cycling that I had never heard in any aircraft I had ever flown or ridden in. And Reeves had not announced it, had not explained it, had not done any of the things a captain does when an aircraft produces an unfamiliar noise with a passenger aboard. He just tapped the altimeter and looked at it, and then looked at the horizon and adjusted his heading by 2 degrees, and I sat beside him and watched his hands and thought, this man does not know what that sound is. I had been evaluating small charter operators for my firm, Halloran Engineering Group, for 7 months when the assignment brought me to Redding Aviation Services, a 3-aircraft operation out of a regional airport in Northern California that had submitted a competitive bid for our survey transport contract. My name is Declan Fogarty. I am an aerospace-trained mechanical engineer, which is relevant because it means I understand aircraft systems at a level above the lay passenger and below the certified mechanic, enough to know what questions to ask, and not always enough to know immediately what the answers should concern me. I had flown with 2 other operators before RAS and had found them competent and documentable. RAS was the third and final candidate, and the bid they had submitted was the strongest on paper. Reasonable rates, good maintenance logs provided in advance, a fleet consisting of 2 Cessna 414As and 1 Beechcraft King Air, and a chief pilot whose credentials had been listed in the bid package as current ATP certificate, 12 years commercial experience, 8 years with RAS specifically. The chief pilot's name was Terrence Reeves. He was 54, with the weathered, unhurried manner of someone who had spent a career in small aircraft. And when he shook my hand at the airport that morning, he projected the specific confidence of a man who is entirely comfortable in cockpits. I noticed his confidence. I was reassured by it. That reassurance was the frame around everything that followed, and the frame was wrong. The flight was supposed to be a demonstration run, 90 minutes out to a survey site location northwest of Redding, a landing at a small regional strip, 15 minutes on the ground, 90 minutes back, standard evaluation procedure. I had done it twice before with the other operators, and both times it had been uneventful and professional, and I had filled out my assessment forms and moved on. Reeves and I had spoken for about 20 minutes before boarding, during which he had explained the routing, the weather picture, clear, light winds, unremarkable, and the handling characteristics of the 414A in terms that were accurate and confident. He used correct terminology. He referenced the right systems. He answered my questions about fuel load and weight and balance with numbers that were correct when I checked them mentally against my own knowledge. I had found nothing to concern me in those 20 minutes, and I had been looking because evaluating operators is partly about looking for the things they do not want you to see. We boarded at 10:22 in the morning. Reeves completed the pre-flight checks with the practice routine of someone who has done them many times, touching each item, reading each gauge, running the checklist with the low, habitual murmur of a person for whom the checklist has become automatic. I watched, and I found nothing. We taxied and took off and climbed to 9,000 feet and flew northwest for 38 minutes. And for 38 minutes, nothing was wrong except the small, accumulating details that I was not yet connecting into a pattern. The first detail was the radio. Charter operations at our altitude on that route require regular position reporting to flight service, and Reeves had made his departure call correctly and his first en-route call at the 20-minute mark correctly, but his phrasing on that second call had been slightly off. Not wrong, not the kind of wrong that would draw a response from flight service, but often the way that happens when someone is recalling a formula rather than executing a practiced habit. I told myself he had an unusual communication style. The second detail was the airspeed. He was flying the 414A at 168 knots indicated, which is slightly below the aircraft's typical cruise speed of around 190 knots at that altitude. Not dangerously slow, not a red flag, but below what an experienced 414A pilot typically targets. And when I had asked him his cruise speed preference in the pre-flight conversation, he had said 190 without hesitation. I noted the discrepancy and told myself it might be fuel conservation. The third detail was his hands. He flew with both hands on the yoke continuously, which is not standard for a relaxed cruise environment in a light twin. Experienced pilots and crews typically use one hand and let the aircraft fly itself, intervening as needed. Reeves kept both hands on the yoke the entire time. Not tightly, not in the white-knuckled way of fear, but continuously, on with the sustained attention of someone who is not entirely certain what the aircraft might do if he let it go. Then the instrument panel made its sound and he tapped the altimeter, and the details stopped being separate. I said his name once, calmly. He looked at me. I said, "What is that cycling sound?" He said he thought it might be the gyro on the attitude indicator, that it sometimes did that it was nothing to worry about. I asked how long it had been doing that. He said on and off for a few weeks. I asked whether it was in the maintenance log. He said he believed it had been noted. His voice was steady and his face was composed. But he had looked back at the panel before he finished the sentence, which meant he was monitoring something he was not certain about while telling me not to be concerned about it. When I let a beat of silence pass, which is a technique I use when I want to see what someone does with quiet, and what Reeves did with it was check the altimeter again. I said, "I want to declare a precautionary divert." I said it calmly, using the correct aviation phrasing, because aviation is a domain where precise language matters and because I wanted him to understand that I was not a frightened passenger, but a person with enough knowledge to make a formal operational request. He said that was not necessary, that we were fine. I said I would like to divert regardless. He looked at me with the evaluating expression of a man trying to determine whether I was going to be a problem. And then he said, "Let me check on something." And he reached for the radio, and what he did next was the moment everything crystallized. He called flight service. He gave our position and our registration number, which was N5842T, and then he said he was considering a precautionary divert to the nearest suitable field due to a minor instrument anomaly and requested field options. Flight service responded with two options: a small municipal airport 14 miles southeast, and the regional airport we had departed from, 41 miles behind us. Normal procedure. What was not normal was what flight service said next after a pause that lasted approximately 4 seconds, which is a long pause in radio communication. The controller said, "Confirm you are the pilot in command of N5842T?" Reeves said he was. The controller said, "Stand by." He stood us by for 11 seconds. Then he came back and said he needed Reeves to confirm his certificate number for the record. Reeves gave a number. Now, I had my phone in my hand, and I was already pulling up the FAA Airman Inquiry Database, which is public and searchable because I had been a licensed pilot for 8 years and I knew it existed. I typed in the name Terrence Reeves in the state of California and the certification level of ATP. The search returned one result. The certificate number on the result was not the number Reeves had just given the controller. The certificate in the database was listed as expired. 14 months ago. 14 months. The aircraft was at 9,000 feet. I was sitting 18 inches from a man who, according to the federal database I was reading on my phone, was not legally authorized to be in that seat. Everything in my body went very still. Not the stillness of calm, the stillness of a system going into high-efficiency mode, routing all available power to the functions that matter. My breathing slowed. My vision sharpened. My hands, which I had been resting in my lap, I pressed flat against my thighs and felt them perfectly steady. I had 4 facts. The instrument anomaly was unresolved. The controller had put us on standby. The certificate number did not match. The listed certificate was expired. I had to decide in the next 90 seconds what to do with those facts in a moving aircraft at 9,000 feet, with the person whose credentials I had just invalidated sitting 2 feet to my left and controlling the only thing between us and the ground. I made the decision that anyone with 400 hours and an engineering brain makes when the options reduce to 2. I could say nothing and let Reeves land the aircraft, hoping his 14 months of post-expiry flying had kept his skills intact. Or I could take control of the situation while we still had altitude and options and functioning engines. I said, "Terrence, I want you to tell me your certificate number again." He looked at me. His face changed. Not dramatically, not the theatrical collapse of a caught man, but something behind his eyes shifted. The micro-adjustment of someone whose constructed reality has just been punctured. He said the same number again. I showed him my phone. I said, "That number doesn't match the FAA database. That number also shows an expired certification." His hand stayed on the yoke. His eyes went back to the panel. He said nothing for 3 seconds, and then he said, "The database has an error." It did not have an error. I knew it did not have an error because FAA airman records are updated within 72 hours of any certification action, and because the expiration date on the record I was looking at corresponded exactly to a renewal cycle 14 months prior, the kind of specific, calendrical precision that databases do not generate by accident. What it told me was that Reeves had let his ATP renewal lapse 14 months ago and had continued operating as though it had not. Whether through an administrative failure he had told himself he would correct, or a deliberate decision to continue flying without dealing with the bureaucratic renewal process, or something worse than either of those, I did not know yet, and the inside of a single-engine aircraft at 9,000 feet was not the environment for finding out. I keyed the radio myself. I said, "Flight service, this is N5842T. I am the co-pilot, and I am declaring an emergency diversion to the nearest field. We need priority handling." I use the word emergency deliberately because in aviation, the word emergency activates a specific response chain, and I wanted that chain activated. Flight service came back immediately and directed us to the municipal field 14 miles southeast. I looked at Reeves and said, "I will navigate. You fly the aircraft to that field." He looked at me for a moment, and then he turned the aircraft southeast, and we flew 14 miles in silence, and he landed the 414A on runway 24 without incident. Because whatever else Terrence Reeves was or was not, he could still physically fly an airplane, which is not the same thing as being legally authorized to do so, but was what I needed from him in that specific 14 minutes. We taxied to the ramp and shut down, and I got out of the aircraft and walked to the edge of the tarmac and stood there for a moment with the Sierra Nevada visible in the middle distance and the sound of the engines ticking down behind me and my hands finally, mildly, not steady, not shaking, just slightly less than the absolute stillness they had been in the air. I called my company's general counsel, a man named Arthur Fenn, who had been practicing aviation and corporate law for 24 years and who answered his cell on the second ring because I had texted him while we were still on approach. I told him what had happened in the sequence it had happened without editorializing. And when I finished, he said, "Stay on the ramp, don't leave the aircraft unattended, and don't let Reeves leave either." I went back to the aircraft. Reeves was still in the left seat, which I had not expected. He was filling out the flight log. I stood at the open door and said, "I need you to stay here until some people arrive." He looked at me and said, "I know, just those 2 words. I know." And then he went back to filling out the log, which was either the most brazen thing I had ever seen or the act of a man so thoroughly captured by his own professional habits that he was going through the motions of a normal landing even as everything around him disassembled. I stood by the aircraft and waited and called my wife and told her I had landed safely at an airport I had not planned to land at, which was technically accurate. The FAA arrived first. A safety inspector named David Accardia, who had been with the agency for 16 years and who drove up in a government-issue sedan within 40 minutes of my radio call, which told me he had been moving fast from somewhere close. He introduced himself with his title and employee number and asked for the aircraft registration and Reeves's certificate information. I gave him my phone with the database search still open. He looked at it. He looked at Reeves, who had by then stepped out of the aircraft and was standing on the ramp with his hands in his jacket pockets. Acharya asked Reeves for his certificate. Reeves produced a physical document from his wallet. Acharya examined it with the specific attention of someone who examines documents professionally. He compared the numbers. He made a call on his radio. Yet he came back and spoke to Reeves for 6 minutes in a voice I was not close enough to hear fully, though I caught the phrase certificate of aircraft registry, and the phrase your authorization to act as pilot in command, and the phrase you will need to remain available. Then he came to me and said he would need a full statement. and I gave him one. Standing on the ramp with a small municipal airport going about its quiet weekday business around us for 42 minutes. He recorded everything on a digital device and had me review and confirm the timeline twice. He told me the FAA investigation would begin immediately and that I would be contacted for follow-up. He said I had done the right thing by declaring the emergency diversion, and he said it in the tone of a man who was also saying, "You probably prevented something worse," without wanting to specify what the worst thing might have been. The NTSB was notified because the emergency declaration triggered mandatory reporting, and an investigator named Priya Sundaram, who held a senior accident investigation role with the board and had 12 years in aviation safety, called me 2 days later for a supplementary statement. She was thorough and unhurried and asked questions that went beyond the flight itself. She wanted to know about the bid package, the credentials RAS had submitted, the maintenance logs I had been provided in advance. I sent her everything I had, including the bid package with Reeves's listed qualifications. She thanked me and said the information would be incorporated into a broader review. I asked her what broader review meant. She said that when a certificate violation of this nature was identified, the agency looked at the full operational history of the certificate holder and the operator, not just the incident that triggered the report. She said it as a statement of procedure, not as a preview, but I understood what she was telling me. They were going to look at every flight Reeves had made in the 14 months since his certificate had lapsed. Every single one. The number, I would later learn from Arthur Fenn, who had obtained it through the NTSB's public affairs process, was 219 flights. Reeves had conducted 219 revenue-generating charter flights as an unlicensed pilot in 14 months. He had carried passengers on every one of them. I sat with that number for a long time. Arthur Fenn filed a formal complaint on my behalf against RAS with the FAA, citing fraudulent misrepresentation of pilot credentials in a commercial bid process. He also sent a certified letter to every one of the other companies he could identify that had been in contact with RAS about charter services in the preceding 14 months, informing them of the certificate status finding and advising them of their potential exposure. 2 of those companies had already completed charter contracts with RAS. One of them, a construction firm, had used RAS for 8 flights carrying employees to remote work sites. When the construction firm's legal team learned what had happened, they retained their own aviation attorney and filed a separate regulatory complaint. The passenger claims that followed were numerous and are still, to my knowledge, working through various stages of legal resolution. I was not party to those claims. I was a witness and a complainant, which is a different position, and Arthur was careful to keep it that way. What I was, operationally, was the person who had been sitting in the right seat of a Cessna 414A when the instrument panel made a sound nobody explained, and the altimeter got tapped with 2 fingers that did not know what they were looking for. The FAA revoked Reeves's certificate permanently. He had failed to renew, had operated anyway, had submitted fraudulent credentials to commercial clients, and had misrepresented his certification status to at least 3 charter inquiry processes that investigators identified. The revocation was accompanied by a civil penalty assessed against him personally and a referral to the Department of Justice for evaluation of potential criminal charges under federal aviation statutes. The criminal evaluation, last I heard from Arthur, was ongoing. RAS's operating certificate was suspended pending the full investigation. The suspension effectively ended the company because a charter operator cannot generate revenue without a valid operating certificate, and the suspension stretched through the investigation window and beyond it. The 2 other aircraft in the fleet were grounded. The one other employed pilot, a man with valid credentials who had apparently not known about Reeves's lapse, or had made himself not know, which is its own moral category, was removed from flight duties and interviewed by the FAA at length. I do not know what happened to him after that. I do not know what happened to the ground staff or the administrative employees of RAS, the people who had processed the bookings and confirmed the manifests and sent the bid packages with the fraudulent credentials listed on page 4. I think about them sometimes. The ordinary infrastructure of a small operation that had been built, at its center, on something that was not true. The bid package that landed Reeves's qualifications on my desk had been prepared by someone. The maintenance logs that looked clean had been signed by someone. The invoices for 219 flights had been processed by someone. Whether they knew or whether they had been as deceived as the passengers is a question that belongs to the investigators and eventually to the courts. And I do not have the answer. I did not take another charter flight for 4 months after that day. When I did, I flew with a regional operator that Arthur had vetted at a level of thoroughness that would have satisfied a federal audit. And the pilot, a woman named Captain Leora Ben David, 14 years commercial experience, current ATP, current medical, everything confirmed in the database before we boarded, flew me to a site survey in the Cascades in a King Air 200 with the unhurried competence of someone who has nothing to prove and everything to confirm. She answered every question I asked with the directness of a professional who considers informed passengers an asset rather than an intrusion. The flight was 2 hours and 12 minutes, and it was mechanically and legally and in every way that mattered. And exactly what it was supposed to be. When we landed and I stepped off the aircraft, she asked if the flight had met my expectations. I said it had exceeded them. She nodded and went back to her post-flight checks, and I walked to the rental car and sat in it for a moment and thought about 9,000 feet and two tapped fingers and the 14 seconds of radio silence before a controller asked a man to confirm his certificate number. I thought about 219 flights and the people on them who had not been sitting in the right seat, who had not had 400 hours in an engineering brain, and the presence of mind to pull up a federal database mid-flight. I thought about what they had trusted and what that trust had been worth, and what it had taken for the thing underneath the trust to become visible. And then I started the car, because there was a survey site to reach and work to do, and the only thing I knew for certain about what had happened was that I was here to do it.